Greetings and welcome back to part 3 of our lecture on ancient China. Today's lesson goes along with worksheet 6, which you should have picked up, titled the same, Ancient China, Han Empires in China. Today we'll talk about the longest lasting dynasty in China, the Han Dynasty obviously, and even talk a little bit about empresses that ruled in China as well. So let us get started. Here's obviously a map of China. This is what the Han Dynasty looked like after the dynasty had fallen, later on in early 200s AD. By the end of their rule, they actually expanded, more than doubled, obviously, their size to the point of where it almost looks like modern China today. Modern China today actually goes a little bit further west, more along over here, and stretches, this part here actually is part of Mongolia up here. Mongolia is right in here. But they did certainly expand their territories into what modern day China is, and we can thank that to the Hans. So, getting started with our worksheet 6, setting the stage. Shi Hangdao and the Qin dynasty had unified China. If you recall from our last unit, when the Qin dynasty took over, there were several different smaller sects or parts of China, and it was the Qin dynasty that basically forced them into one kingdom or one empire through war. Shortly after his death, though, the China again fell apart. The son of Shi Hangdai was a poor leader. He lasted only 2 years, and it ended up, as I mentioned, China falling apart back to the local warlords. But thankfully, or not thankfully I guess, the Han Dynasty restored unity to China. After several years of anguish from the Qin, rival kings wanted to get control back of their territory that had once been taken by Shi Hangdi. After defeating Zhang Yu, Liu Bang declared himself the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. These old kings took control, and they were fighting amongst themselves, wanting more power, just as all kings do. But it wasn't until till Liu Bang was able to defeat or make agreements with these other regions to retake China as it had once been. The Han Dynasty had been separated into two periods throughout its entire history. So remember that. The Han Dynasty was split up into two parts, which we'll talk about each later on. The first being longer than the second. They were separated obviously because of a brief time period when the Huns were out of power. So keep that in the back of your head, because we will be touching upon that near the end of the lecture. Liu Bang was able to get rid of rival kings through war, just like any others. But he also created allies. When he did get control, he created a central government with hundreds of local provincials, or provincials as they call them, called camaraderies. Think of this as smaller states, kind of like what we have in the United States. Broke it down, however, his rule was the ultimate rule. And just like the Qin dynasty, he set off his own personal people to oversee these provincials. To get the people happy and to like him, he lowered taxes and softened harsh punishments. People were kind of upset about the Qin dynasty and the previous dynasties and how harsh they were, and the high taxes, people not being able to survive and still pay taxes. So to get everybody to like him, he did those things. Liu Bang died in 195 BC, and his son took over, but only in title only. Now listen here, because you're going to kind of sound or get some similarities here with something that happened in Egypt. His mother, Empress Liu, had the real power because her friends suggested to her that she seize power. Empress Liu lived longer than her son, but then continued to name other infants to be empire. Well, because of that, and these infants not being of age to be empires, she was able to still hold on to the power because these infants were too young to rule. But, as with everybody, eventually she died in 180 BC, and Liu Bang's family regained control. To prevent Empress Liu's family from regaining power, Liu Bang's family killed off all of her relatives. Killed off sisters, children, uncles, aunts, whatever, cousins, to make sure that she can't come back. Kind of sounds a little familiar with the power struggle we saw with Hatshepsut in Egypt, with a woman taking over in a man's world. Liu Bang's great-grandson took the throne in 141 BC. He was known as the Martial Emperor because he adopted the policy of extending the empire through war, which seems to be a common theme among many of these male emperors. You want more land? Let's beat everybody in to get it. Wu Di, which was his name, created allies and pushed his northern enemies out of the region. To the north, if you recall, they had the nomads. These nomads kept invading China in order to use the Chinese pasture lands for their own flock. Well, obviously China and the Chinese people didn't like that too much. So Wu Di ended up taking his huge army, pushing them farther and farther out, not only getting rid of these nomads, but also expanding his northern empire as well. Once he was able to better secure the north, he then turned his army to the south, taking over parts of Vietnam, as well as further east and northeast as well, in the areas of what we call present-day Manchuria and North and South Korea. So he certainly expanded. Now, a little sidebar here. If you look at why is it in the dynasties it does not necessarily go from father to son. It typically does. But when we're talking about dynasties, it also can stay within the family. So a lot of times you'd actually have leadership go from father to son or from uncle to nephew, whatever the case may be, depending on who the children were and which was the male. And it didn't necessarily have to be the oldest male son either. It was usually up to the emperor to choose his first wife out of several or many that he had, and that first wife and the emperor would choose who the new emperor would be. Obviously, if the emperor had a harem of several wives and all these children, the empresses were always at ends with each other, trying to get the attention of the emperor. They want to be the first wife. They want the special privileges. They want their child to be the emperor. So a lot of times there was this infighting between all the women who were the wives of the emperor to get their child to be the future ruler.